January 10th, 2021. Saudi state television broadcasts a presentation unlike anything the world has seen before. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stands before a screen. Behind him, renderings of something that defies description. A city, if you can call it that, a line cutting through the desert. Two mirrored walls rising 500 meters into the sky, stretching 170 kilometers from the Red Sea coast to the mountains of Tabuk province. No roads, no cars, no carbon emissions. 9 million residents living in a vertical paradise where everything is within a 5-minute walk. The future, built in the desert. MBS speaks with the confidence of a man who has never been told no. The line will tackle the challenges facing humanity in urban life today, he declares, and will shine a light on alternative ways to live. The promotional video that follows is mesmerizing. Residents glide through gleaming corridors bathed in natural light. Parks float in the sky. The mirrored exterior reflects the desert landscape, making the structure seem to disappear into its surroundings. Drones deliver packages. High-speed trains travel the length of the city in 20 minutes. This is not a proposal. This is not a concept study. This is, according to Saudi Arabia, a project already under construction, a cornerstone of Vision 2030. A statement to the world that the kingdom can build anything it imagines. The international response is immediate. Architects gasp, urban planners shake their heads, engineers reach for calculators, journalists scramble to understand what they've just witnessed. Is this real? Can this be built? The questions multiply. The doubts accumulate. The criticisms emerge. But in Riyadh, none of that matters. The Public Investment Fund, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, with nearly $1 trillion in assets, has committed to making this happen. The Crown Prince has staked his reputation on it. The machinery of state has begun to move. Ground will be broken. Workers will arrive. The desert will be transformed. Or so they believed. The numbers never made sense. From the moment the line was announced, engineers and construction experts began doing calculations. What they found was troubling. 170 kilometers long, 500 meters tall, 200 meters wide. To put this in perspective, the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building, took 6 years to construct and stands 828 meters tall. The line would require building the equivalent of hundreds of Burj Khalifas, connected together, stretched across a distance greater than the length of England. Professor Mike Cook of Imperial College London didn't mince words. "I think it's such a crackpot idea," he told New Civil Engineer magazine. "Surely everyone agrees who is involved in city planning. To think that you're going to build it within a few years is unrealistic." The construction rate required was staggering. For the line to be completed by 2030, Cook calculated, it would need to be constructed at 15,000 times the rate of normal UK construction times. Not 15 times. Not 150 times. 15,000 times. But the math problems extended beyond construction speed. The population density proposed was unprecedented in human history. 9 million people in a structure 200 meters wide would create density of 260,000 people per square kilometer. Manila, the world's most densely populated city, has 44,000 per square kilometer. The line would be 6 times denser. How do you move 9 million people through a structure only 200 meters wide? How do you provide natural light to residents living in the interior? How do you handle waste, water, electricity for a city stretched across 170 kilometers? How do you build anything at all in temperatures that regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius? These questions had answers, according to NEOM. Revolutionary answers, technological answers. Answers that would redefine what was possible. But answers cost money, and the cost estimates kept climbing. The initial budget was reportedly $500 billion for all of NEOM, with the line as its centerpiece. By 2022, internal estimates placed the cost of the line alone at $1.6 trillion. A year later, that figure had grown to $4.5 trillion. By some accounts, projected costs eventually reached $8.8 trillion. $8.8 trillion, More than the annual GDP of every country on Earth, except the United States and China, for a single construction project. The numbers didn't make sense because they couldn't make sense. What was being proposed wasn't difficult. It was, by conventional engineering standards, impossible. But impossibility had never stopped Mohammed bin Salman before. They came from everywhere. Architects from London, engineers from Tokyo, project managers from New York, urban planners from Singapore, the best and brightest in their fields, lured by salaries that defied industry standards and the promise of working on something historic. NEOM hired aggressively. At its peak, the project employed tens of thousands of people across multiple disciplines. Consulting firms that normally worked on modest developments found themselves contracted for work valued in the billions. The atmosphere in those early days was electric. We were building the future. One former employee told the Financial Times. That's what we believed. That's what we told ourselves. The work was real. Excavation began in October 2021. Crews carved into the desert floor. Foundation work commenced. Piling rigs operated around the clock, drilling massive supports into the ground. The scale of the earth moving was genuinely impressive. Satellite images showed the landscape transforming. Roads appeared. Support facilities emerged. The footprint of something enormous became visible from space, but even the believers had doubts. The design kept changing. What was approved 1 month was revised the next. Decisions made by engineers were overruled by executives who were themselves overruled by authorities closer to the Crown Prince. The chain of command was murky, the direction unclear. One senior construction manager described the experience to the Financial Times. I clearly only did what I thought was sensible. Sensible. The word hangs in the air, because much of what the line required wasn't sensible by any traditional definition. It required believing that normal rules didn't apply, that Saudi money and Saudi determination could overcome Saudi physics. The foundation work alone illustrated the challenge. The piles driven into the ground were among the largest ever constructed anywhere, 2.5 to 3 meters in diameter. Absolutely colossal. According to specialists who worked on the project, about 6,000 of them were drilled into the ground across 2 kilometers of desert. The cost, several $billion. Just for foundations, just for a tiny fraction of the total length. And even as these foundations were being completed, the plans they were meant to support were already being scaled back. The believers kept believing until they couldn't anymore. The desert wasn't empty. In the path of the line lived the Howeitat tribe, a community that had called this region home for generations. Their villages stood where the mirrored walls were meant to rise. Their lives were inconvenient facts in a grand vision. The Saudi government offered compensation, relocation packages. New homes elsewhere, some accepted. Others refused. Abdul Rahim, al-Huwaiti, was among those who refused. A member of the Howeitat tribe, he posted videos on social media opposing the forced displacement of his community. He spoke of ancestral lands, of rights, of a home that money couldn't replace. In April 2020, Saudi security forces arrived at his home in the village of Al-Qariba. Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti was shot dead. The official account described an exchange of fire. Critics called it an execution. What is undisputed is that a man who publicly opposed NEOM died at the hands of the state. His death didn't stop the project. His death didn't stop the resistance either. In October 2022, 3 men of the Howeitat tribe Shadili and Atala al-Huwaiti were sentenced to death for refusing to vacate their village. Shadli was Abdul Rahim's brother. Their crime, according to prosecutors, was related to their opposition to relocation. The village of Kayel was flattened. 15 members of the Howeitat tribe were sent to prison, some for up to 50 years. 3 faced execution. Human rights organizations condemned the sentences. International media reported on the displacements. The Crown Prince's grand vision was built. It became clear. On the removal of people who had lived on this land long before anyone imagined mirrored cities. NEOM's response was silence. The construction continued, but something had changed in how the world viewed this project. The line wasn't just an ambitious urban experiment anymore. It was a development that required the destruction of communities, the imprisonment of dissenters, and the execution of those who refused to move. The future, it turned out, came at a cost measured not just in dollars, They arrived by the thousands. From Pakistan, from India, from Bangladesh, Nepal, the Philippines. Men who left their families for contracts that promised wages impossible to earn at home. Men who boarded planes to a desert they'd never seen to build a city they'd never inhabit. The conditions they encountered were harsh. Summer temperatures in the NEOM region regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius. Construction work in such heat is not merely uncomfortable, it is dangerous. The human body struggles to cool itself when ambient temperatures approach body temperature. Heat stroke becomes a constant threat. Saudi labor laws require work stoppages during the hottest hours. Whether those stoppages were consistently observed at NEOM is disputed. What isn't disputed is that workers died. How many workers died is a matter of significant controversy. A documentary released in 2024 by the B1M, a construction-focused media outlet, alleged that upwards of 21,000 workers from South Asia had died on NEOM projects. The figure was attributed to sources within the project, though NEOM denied it. Saudi Arabia does not publish detailed statistics on worker deaths in construction projects. What we know comes from fragments. A worker collapsed from heat exhaustion here. An accident on a construction site there. Families in South Asia who stopped receiving phone calls and eventually received both. The kafala system, which ties workers' legal status to their employers, made complaints difficult. Workers who raised concerns risked deportation. Workers who tried to leave before their contracts ended found their passports held by employers. This was not unique to NEOM. The kafala system operates across the Gulf, but NEOM's scale meant that any systemic problems were amplified. More workers meant more potential victims. More construction meant more potential accidents. The men who built the line's foundations will never live in the city they constructed. Many will never see it completed. Some will never return home at all. Their names don't appear in the promotional videos. Their stories aren't told in the investor presentations. They exist in the margins of a grand vision, visible only to those who look. By 2024, the optimism was fading. Inside NEOM, employees who had arrived believing they were building the future began to suspect they were building something else entirely. The constant changes in direction. The unrealistic time. The gap between what was announced and what was achievable. The whispers started quietly. The project won't work. Everyone knows it won't work. It's just a matter of letting MBS down gently. These sentiments, reported by the Financial Times, based on interviews with more than 20 people who worked on the line, revealed an organization in denial. Architects designed structures they doubted would be built. Engineers solved problems they knew would be replaced by other problems. Managers managed teams working toward goals everyone suspected were unreachable. The foreign investment that NEOM had counted on never materialized. Some wealthy Saudi families put modest sums into the project. But the large investments Riyadh hoped to attract from international backers, the sovereign wealth funds, the institutional investors, the global corporations, never came. Why would they? The math hadn't changed. The line still required construction rates that defied physics, still required budgets that defied economics, still required timelines that defied reality. Smart money watched from a distance. The only entity willing to fund this vision was the entity that had imagined it. The Saudi Public Investment Fund. And even PIF was beginning to feel the strain. Oil prices, which had surged in 2022, began to moderate. The kingdom's budget deficits widened. Other Vision 2030 projects competed for the same limited pool of capital. Questions emerged about priorities. Should Saudi Arabia spend trillions on a linear city when it had roads to build, schools to fund, an economy to diversify? The question answered itself differently depending on who was asking. For MBS, the line was essential. A symbol of what Saudi Arabia could achieve. A statement to the world that couldn't be withdrawn. For the technocrats managing the budget, the line was becoming a problem. A project that consumed resources without delivering returns. A liability disguised as an asset. The cracks widened, and then came the scaling back. July 2025. Bloomberg reported that Saudi Arabia had asked consulting firms to conduct a strategic review of the line. The language was careful. A strategic review, common practice for long-term developments. But the implications were clear. Something had changed. The details emerged gradually. Instead of 170 kilometers by 2030, Officials now expected only 2.4 kilometers to be completed. The numbers told the story of retreat from 170 kilometers to 2.4 kilometers, a reduction of 98.6%, from 1.5 million residents to 300,000. A reduction of 80%, from a city that would revolutionize urban living to a demonstration project that might prove a concept. Semaphore reported that NEOM was preparing to lay off a significant portion of its workforce. More than 1,000 employees would be relocated from the construction site to Riyadh. The move meant losing on-site benefits, housing, meals, effectively a pay cut for those who remained. CNBC, citing sources close to the project, reported that development had been frozen on large sections of the line. The number of active construction workers had been cut by 35% since April 2025. The Public Investment Fund recorded an $8 billion write-down linked to NEOM. $8 billion. Gone. Written off. Acknowledged as value that existed on paper but not in reality. The retreat wasn't announced with fanfare. There was no press conference. No admission that the original vision had been unachievable. Just quiet adjustments. Revised timelines. Reduced expectations. NEOM's official position remained optimistic. The line remains a strategic priority, the organization told Bloomberg. The project was entering a phase of complex engineering and detailed design work. But the workers, being laid off, knew what complex engineering meant. It meant the dream was dying. September 16, 2025. The Saudi Public Investment Fund suspended work on the line construction project until further notice. The announcement was not made publicly. There was no press release, no official statement. The information emerged through sources, through reporting, through the gradual accumulation of evidence that something fundamental had changed. Construction sites fell quiet. Workers were sent home. Equipment sat idle. The machinery that had been reshaping the desert ground to a halt. International media described the line as a likely failure. The Financial Times called it a project undone by the laws of physics and finance. Gizmodo declared that Saudi Arabia's dystopian futuristic city project was crashing and burning. The language was harsh. The language was accurate. What had been announced as the largest infrastructure project in human history had been reduced to 2.4 kilometers of partially completed foundations. Billions of dollars had been spent. Thousands of workers had labored in desert heat. Communities had been displaced. Lives had been lost. And now it was over. Or paused. Or being reconsidered. The official terminology mattered less than the reality. The cranes weren't moving. The piling rigs weren't drilling. The future that MBS had promised wasn't being built. What remained was a scar in the desert. Foundation work for a city that might never rise. Infrastructure for a vision that had collided with reality. Inside the kingdom, the suspension raised uncomfortable questions. What happens to the money already spent? What happens to the contracts already signed? What happens to the reputation of a crown prince who staked so much on a project that could be completed? The answers weren't forthcoming. In Saudi Arabia, uncomfortable questions about the crown prince tend to go unasked. The desert keeps its secrets. In Tabak province, along the planned route of the line, the evidence of ambition remains visible. Excavations that lead nowhere, foundations that support nothing, roads built to serve as a city that exists only in renderings. The 2.4 kilometers of completed work stands as testimony to what was attempted. The foundation piles those colossal structures driven into the ground at enormous cost weight for vertical construction that may never come. Some work continues. Dragina, the mountain resort planned for NEOM, still advances toward its 2029 Asian Winter Games deadline. Though there are reports that even this timeline may slip, that Saudi officials are considering postponing the games until 2033. The NEOM Stadium, designed to be suspended 350 meters at the top of the line and intended to host 2034 FIFA World Cup matches, exists now only as a question. How do you build a stadium at the top of a city that isn't being built? The official position remains that the line will eventually span 100 kilometers, that the vision persists even if the timeline has stretched from 2030 to 2045. that what has been paused will eventually resume. Maybe world has seen grand projects abandoned before. Cities planned, but never built. Monuments imagined, but never raised. History is littered with the remnants of ambition that exceeded capability. The line may join that history, or it may yet rise, decades from now, in some form that its original designers wouldn't recognize. The future is uncertain. The present is a construction site frozen in time. What isn't uncertain is the cost already paid. The billions of dollars, the workers who died, the families displaced, the men sentenced to death for refusing to leave their ancestral lands. These costs don't appear on balance sheets. They aren't captured in write-downs. They exist in hospital records and prison cells, and the memories of communities that no longer exist. Mohammed bin Salman once said that the line would shine a light on alternative ways to live. Perhaps it has shown the alternative of unlimited ambition meeting limited reality, of visions that inspire colliding with physics that constrain, of a world where money can buy many things, but cannot buy the impossible. The mirrored walls were meant to reflect the desert. Instead, they reflect us, our hopes for better cities, our fears of unchecked power, our fascination with the future and our inability to escape the present. The line stretches across the Saudi desert, unbuilt. A monument to what might have been, a warning about what was attempted. The desert wind blows sand across the abandoned excavations. The future waits. For what? No one knows.